Bastion is an action role-playing game that was released back in 2011. I remember following some of this game's development from the then brand new Supergiant Games. Their founders came from Electronic Arts, Amir Rao and Gavin Simon. I already know I probably said Amir's name wrong, so sorry about that. They bought a house and started their own company to make their own independent games. When I first started following the development was when they started putting out documentary-style self-made videos onto a gaming website called Giant Bomb. This was also when Greg Kasavin joined their team as well. I knew him mostly from his past experience working for GameSpot, but he too also worked for Electronic Arts and then went to write for Supergiant Games. I recommend watching their videos of how they made this game as it was all coming together. I learned from those videos about why they need tooltips in the loading screens as well as some other interesting things needed for Xbox certification at the time. I never played Bastion at release. It always looked really interesting, though at that time in my life I didn't really play top-down style games as I just overlooked them for the most part. Eventually I did buy it on Steam and then finally played it for this video. I wanted to experience all, or at least most of Supergiant Games before going on to play Hades, since that game is so well received. Most likely after this I'll just end up playing Transistor and then go on to Hades. My first playthrough of Bastion only took me roughly 3.5 hours to beat. There was still plenty more to experience, with weapon upgrades and some other variations of making the gameplay harder as well as challenge sections. I didn't find the game too difficult, but I'm also not very good at the game as you can probably tell from the footage playing. Though it was very enjoyable to play through. I highly recommend checking it out, it's probably pretty cheap at this point. The game starts off with your character waking up with some narration talking over everything you do, see, and experience in the game. I think the voiceover by Logan Cunningham is by far one of the best I've ever heard in a game. At first it seemed like a typical scruffy voice, but it played to the game's atmosphere and tone really well after a little bit.
Those feet as it pointing the way. He don't stop to wonder why. Finds his lifelong friend just lying in the road.
You play as a character called the Kid. I'm not sure if he actually has a name, at least I never heard or saw it as they were just always referenced to as the Kid. The crux of the story is you being alive after a major calamity struck a place called Colombia, which is harder to pronounce than I thought. It turned the road into many floating pieces that builds itself as you explore. This concept is neat. I love looking at and hearing the road constantly build itself around me. Thankfully falling off the road doesn't just kill you, and the narrator mentions this as well. You end up meeting the narrator at a place called Bastion. His name is Rux and he tasks you with finding some cores to be able to repair the Bastion to working order. You don't really know what the Bastion is until rather late in the game. The adventure ends up sending you to many different places and seeing the after effects of the calamity as it turned just about everyone into ash, but you do come across some survivors. There may be more, but I only found 2 in playing. A man named Zolf as well as a woman named Zia. They both stay at the town and give you some small bits of information of the road too. I'm going to mention the rest of the story now, but it isn't too much at least. The game just moves and the story is interesting for the most part, but I feel the combat is the main draw of the game alongside the world design and narration. If you want to skip the story spoilers, there will be a timestamp on screen now. As you progress in the story, you find a book that was written by Zia's father. Their people were called Ura and there are a bunch of them still alive. Well, Zolf ended up reading the book and then decided to take Zia with him to the Ura survivors. Apparently mankind, or Bastion itself, actually caused the calamity and he tries to stop this from continuing on. Eventually, he destroys a lot of the Bastion and you have to rebuild it again before turning it on for yourself, giving 2 options. Keep this world as it is, or return before the calamity and possibly fix everything. This option was too much of an unknown, and I chose to just carry on. However, both options just end the game and you just start a new game plus right away. The characters are interesting too, even though there isn't too much to them. You find out that the narrator, Rux, actually built the Bastion. Zia is kinda just there, but she does finally speak in her own voice at the very end of the game, which is a nice touch.
So, let's see. You can either prevent the calamity, or stick around with me and Rex. I'd hate to be in your shoes.
Zolf ended up being turned on by his own people since I came into the town and killed everyone. I chose to let him die since he tried to kill me once already. You do also notice at times that the road wasn't always terrible, and that the creatures that you've been fighting weren't always hostile, as they were usually born friendly, as they show at times in the game. But that's the basis of the story, and now it is time to talk about the gameplay. The gameplay is rather simple, yet can be rewarding if played correctly, which I was only able to do a few times. You have 2 main weapon slots. I believe you can have 2 separate melee weapons at the same time, but I always had a projectile weapon on me too. You get an assortment of weapons found on the road, from a hammer, sword, spear, gun, and so on. They all do what you expect and all have different attacks, attack speeds, as well as range. I try to stick with the same weapon during my run, the sword and the repeater, but every time you find a new weapon in the game, It automatically replaces what you have equipped. I understand the need for this, but I've never been a big fan of this in games. It forces you to vary your tactics and possibly do something better, but I like having the option of choosing what I like when playing. But I understand and rather agree with this implementation in the game. Thankfully you can change your weapons back at Bastion, or even sometimes during some levels. The enemy variety is mostly okay, though later on in the game, the enemies tend to be rather all the same, and they usually make your view blurry, which I found to be annoying. This is also most likely just me playing poorly. It was really fun to learn the timing to do counterattacks on projectiles or some enemy attacks, as well as dodging at the right time to avoid damage. The combat is fantastic, and I can't wait to see how much I learned over time when I start playing Hades. The only real complaint I may have towards the combat is sometimes it could feel overwhelming with the amount of projectiles coming in, as well as melee enemies coming in as well, and then dealing with the lockout mechanic automatically targeting the wrong person, allowing you to take damage. It's a rather small complaint though, as if you're quick enough you can change your targets and hopefully avoid this damage. I also didn't like about half of the projectile weapons at all, so sticking with the repeater was rather necessary for me. I found need and use for all melee weapons outside of the flamethrower. They all let the player choose their playstyle. I like to attack quickly, and also being able to throw the weapon too was great, so that's why I stuck with the sword the entire game. But I did find use for the spear as well as the hammer too, as they both had their own useful movesets depending on where you are and what you're trying to do, such as how the spear having a larger reach allowing you to keep more distance when attacking. The last thing that I wasn't a huge fan of was the final section of the game. You're forced to carry a large wooden thing that replaces all of your attacks with either a lunge, ground pound, or a thing that rains down fireballs. If you move faster with this, I wouldn't mind too much, but I was having way more fun with my weapons of choice over this slow moving thing. I wish they let you choose the weapon at the very end of the game instead of having to use this. Even with how short of a time it took me to complete Bastion, it was a great experience. I just wanted to keep hearing the narrator speak and tell me about the road, what was going to happen next, and even talk about people's past. Basically, I just want him to have an audiobook or something. It's just a really damn good voice. This game was originally a Summer of Arcade game on Xbox 360, so that explains the length of the game. I highly recommend checking out Bastion for yourself too, it was a joy to get through. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to see future videos. I have several projects in the works and don't want to commit to what will be out first, as some of those games are long and some are also short. But I'm also playing through several and I can't say which one will be done right away. Also, I had to scrap the Cyberpunk video due to experiencing more bugs than I'd like, as it was starting to take me out of the experience, so that video will be much later, or at least until they fix some of the issues.